Hi everyone, welcome back to this lecture on phonological variation. In the previous video, we were just introduced to the problem of the rule of D-tapping in Tagalog, which appears to have some items that undergo the rule, some items that don't undergo the rule, and some items that may or may not undergo this rule. Now, I think when we try to evaluate this problem from a quantitative perspective, and there is data in the literature, and in particular, Kai Zora from the University of California, Los Angeles has looked at this problem in some detail. If we look to some quantitative data, then the D-tapping problem might be both, on the one hand, harder and easier than we thought. So one particular problem is that almost no word in Tagalog whatsoever exhibits an all or nothing behavior. So I defined the items in 6 through 8 into these 3 strict categories, but in fact, even the words in 7 may sometimes, rarely, undergo D-tapping. And that quantitative definition, seeing that there are some words, the fact that there are no groups of pure non-undergoers and no groups of pure undergoers, means that a categorical description of the D-tapping process will be insufficient. It won't be enough for describing what actually we find in the language. So for instance, if we wanted to describe a non-undergoer as categorically failing to undergo the process as minus D-tapping, how could we explain the fact that we find about 5% of tokens, some 5% of instances of the pronunciation of the word ma-daan occurring with the tap, maraan? And if indeed the word dunong is marked as plus D-tapping, why do we still have a small number, some 0.5% of tokens that still allow the D? So the vast majority of the tokens of this word, ma-dungong, are pronounced with the tap, marudong, but a small amount allow for the stop to still occur. So in those cases, the question is whether it makes sense to talk about D-tapping as merely optional, and instead whether we should mark some more specific properties of the lexical items that are involved. So let's think about these probabilities, these percentages, these likelihoods relating to the lexical items for road and dunong, I've forgotten to give the gloss here, knowledge in Tagalog. So let's provide branching derivations here. So daang or daan only undergoes D-tapping in about 5% of the time. So we can mark this, let's say, in a probabilistic fashion. And let's, on the other hand, dunong is very likely to undergo D-tapping. And we would instead mark this lexical item as saying that D-tapping has a probability of about 99% applying. Now, there are still, we can continue to look at this from the perspective of branching derivation. In principle, then, when we have the prefix ma that creates the phonological environment for D-tapping, then we can find in principle both options, both ma-daang and maraan, and both ma-dunong and marunong. But I will put in bold here the options that are considerably more likely, which is why I initially sorted them into these bins. But because the outcomes are not wholly categorical, then it looks like we need to look at adopt this quantitative perspective again, or instead, I should say. So the textbook system, using the diacritics, the lexical markings of plus rule and minus rule, we could think of those as the limiting cases of lexically specified frequencies. So here we are saying that the lexical items dunong and da'an carry this information. They have this quantitative information about how likely it is that the process of detapping should apply. And perhaps F voicing in English constitutes something closer to a limiting case. So in English, it's very much the case that most lexical items, most nouns cannot undergo F voicing, and there's a small number of nouns like wolves in the plural, for which F voicing is essentially obligatory. Saying wolves seems quite terrible, frankly. So there may be some small number of words that are marked as, let's say, 100% F voicing, and all other words of English would instead be marked as 0%, all other nouns specifically, marked as 0% F voicing. So we've just transformed the categorical system, which says there's either you're an undergoer or a non-undergoer, into a probabilistic system, which says, well, all the words could be undergoers or non-undergoers, and the likelihood that they undergo or don't undergo a process is specified quantitatively, perhaps in the lexicon. And so this Tagalog case, then, to come back to our terminology that we've introduced, this represents a nice instance of so-called type variation, because the cause or the source of the variation doesn't seem to be in the rule itself. So the rule itself is not saying detapping applies 25% of the time, and so for every word where the environment of detapping is met, 25% of the time we find a tap, and 75% of the time we do not. Instead, the likelihood of detapping is specified by the lexical items itself. And this gives an instance of type variation. So now let's contrast this with token variation, where the likelihood of application of a process is specified on the rule itself rather than on the words that might or might not undergo a rule. And the rules that are truly optional, these will generate token variation. And we can consider variable rules to have a rate of application, a likelihood that they will work. And mathematically, it's easy to calculate a rate of applications if you have gathered enough data from the language. So you find how many instances where the rule, how many tokens where the rule could have applied, and you see how many instances where the rule actually was applied. And when you are dealing with cases of true token variation, if we are looking at token variation and not type variation, then we should expect that the rates of one outcome or another outcome for a process are not going to be significantly different across lexical items. That is, each lexical item will show approximately the same frequencies for the different outcome. And as an example, let's consider a process which variably applies in lots of varieties of English, the process of coronal stop deletion. So this applies to a coronal stop like ta or da, and the sound is deleted at the end of a word following another consonant. And from some data that I have found, the process would seem to apply somewhat more than half the time. When we break that rule down, this information in parentheses, where the textbook would have given optional in parentheses next to the rule, we have given a rate of application for the rule, saying the rule is likely to apply about 54% of the time. So both the English words just and sand could potentially undergo this process, and their different outcomes would have different possibilities. So I will say the likelihood of application. I will round it, adjust it to 54% to have an even number. So both of these words, I'll copy them into our document. Just and sand, they both can either undergo or not undergo coronal stop tapping, or deletion rather. And the deletion outcome is the more likely outcome. It will occur on just about 54% of the time, and the result is then just without the stop, or it can fail to apply, and that outcome will occur about 46% of the time. And the same applies to the word sand, where either coronal stop deletion will apply, again about 54% of the time, or fail to apply about 46% of the time. And so the particular outcomes, just, we'll add our phonetic brackets, just, sand, and sand. The probabilities of the variant without the coronal stop or with the coronal stop are the same or approximately the same across all lexemes. This shows us we are dealing with an instance of token variation as opposed to typed variation, like we saw with Tagalog D-tapping, where different lexical items showed very different rates of application of the same process. The word for road was very unlikely to undergo D-tapping, whereas the word knowledge, dunong, was very likely to undergo D-tapping. So now that we've seen a case of both type variation and token variation, let's make sure that we're clear on this difference, and we can summarize it as follows. So the distinction between token and type variation can be summarized using two dimensions, namely the source of the variation and the distribution of the variation. So in token variation, the source is a variable rule, a rule which has a rate of application which is less than 100%, and we find its distribution within lexical items. So the same lexical item, like sand or just, can show both variants, and those variants occur at the same rates across the different lexical items. With type variation, the source of the variation is due to lexical specification. Here, the lexemes in Tagalog were specified with different probabilities for undergoing D-tapping, and we see the distribution more or less across items. We see a lot of D-tapping in the prefixed form of knowledge, but very little D-tapping in the prefixed form of road, daan. So true token variation results from rules with a given likelihood of application, whereas true type variation results from lexical entries that have a specified rate of application for some rule. Let's take another break here, and when we come back to talking about rules that vary or based on different outcomes or different environments, in the meantime, you can practice your familiarity with the terms token variation and type variation by trying to invent a rule and two lexical items in each case, and show what that would look like. So in your case of token variation, you should have derivations that look something like the derivation for English coronal deletion. And in your example with type variation, you should have a derivation that looks something like the illustration with Tagalog D-tapping.